Welcome to the Church of Caron, and it is Wednesday. Usually this would be a Bible, Bourbon, Blues, and Wednesday Church of Caron, but sadly I found out that one of my great mentors, Everett Raymond Kinstler, has passed away. And I always like to think of it as the body has passed, because again, these are just costumes, but the spirit is still bright, even brighter. I just wanted to share a little bit about my experiences with Everett Raymond Kinstler. And before I do so, I thought it appropriate to blast open some of this heaven's door, because Kinstler is through those, well, Bob Dylan has iron gates here. Tennessee Bourbon. This is wonderful Bob Dylan's Tennessee Bourbon. If you haven't watched past videos, by the way, these are on Facebook and YouTube. So cheers to Everett Raymond Kinstler, known as Ev to some, Ray to others, Mr. Kinstler to those who perhaps didn't have a close or a working relationship with him. He was one of a kind, a shooting star that was in my sky, thankfully, gratefully, and a shooting star that once it passes over, as we all know, leaves our hearts and our skies dimmer. But he is making the unseen world definitely brighter. So here's to Everett Raymond Kinstler. Cheers. If you don't know of Everett Raymond Kinstler's work and you're an artist, definitely Google him. And if you're not an artist, it would be great to Google him too. The reason being is that he was one of those artists who, so unique in the sense that he had this ability to communicate in such a warm, loving, and lively manner. He wasn't a brooding artist. And he had actually made money from his art. Some of us are still attempting to do that. All right. But he was able to make money on his art. He painted famous people, Hollywood stars. He painted the presidents. His work is in the White House. Excuse me. I'm such a lightweight. I used to be able to drink a lot more. Now I'm like such a lightweight. Anyway, his work is in the National Portrait Gallery. And I just went and saw an amazing exhibit. Unfortunately, I don't think it's still there, at the Skirball. The Skirball is in Los Angeles, and it's a Jewish history museum. And the fabulous exhibit to Ruth Bader Ginsburg was there. Just amazing. I love that. And as you walked into the exhibit, they had selected an Everett Raymond Kinstler portrait that hung right there of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And she even had a little scrunchie in her hair that he had captured. Delightful. You felt the warmness from Ruth. And of course, Ray was such a warm person as well, that he exuded that in his spirit, and also it came through in his work. When I was young, in my 20s, and a bit younger, I had the privilege of studying with Everett Raymond Kinstler many times with his workshops. And he would affectionately call me Green Fingers because in painting, and at that time I was heavily into oils, I would get a lot of paint on my fingers. And so that was his affectionate name for me, which I finally remember. And we would communicate because I live in California. We would communicate. He lives in New York and Connecticut. We would communicate via letter, and and I'd always sign off Green Fingers, or he'd write to me Green Fingers in green ink, nonetheless. But in my last video, I talked about plugging into good or evil, positive or negative. To be honest, I have no idea if Ray believed in God or not. And, personally, I didn't care. Why? Because A, he was a loving person, so he was tapping into God. Whether he believed in God or not, anyone who plugs into love, is accessing God. And so for me, when people plug into love, I find it irrelevant if they say they believe in God or not, because they're plugging into love, which is God. People get real fixated on whether someone believes in God or someone believes in Jesus. And I am just not that way. I believe if you plug into love, you are plugging into God and Jesus, Yeshua, Hashem, and that, to me, that's enough. But that's how I think. I'm, not thinking in real black and white. There's a lot of people who have to, have certain words said or believe in a certain way. And at the end of the day, it's about love. Kinstler loved his art. He loved art. He loved past artists, as I do. My portrait of Picasso behind me. He loved the art of painting, and it truly is an art. And as artists, we have a special bond because we are unique in how we see. We're seers. And it's just an unspoken bond between all of us. And those who aren't artists don't have that bond. Just like anyone in any profession, I believe. There is a certain bond, a link, because of the way they've been created, that they have pursued and they've tapped into. So Ray was a unique artist because he wasn't a brooder. He was able to do his work at an exceptional level. He had freedom with his work. He was a purist. He loved oil, the paint, the linseed oil, all of that, the smells. He loved the canvas and toning the canvas before he would even start. A lot of people don't know this, but a lot of the past famous artists would tone their canvases either in raw umber or green tones, and those tones then, when you put your paint on the canvas, affects that color, as opposed to a white canvas where you put the paint on, like white paint on a white canvas is not going to give you the same effect or flesh tones on a white canvas as a darker toned canvas will give you. And because Ray was so consumed with doing portraiture, that was really key for him to tone that canvas first. And that's where I first learned that. You don't have to, but it is definitely a technique that the old masters used, and Kinstler also, and many others. So he had this enormous love for the palette, the wooden palette. He had this wooden palette that he would use, very traditional. How the paints would be laid out on his palette, where they would be, the brushes he used. Oh boy, I used to hear him talk about his brushes. And the hair of the brushes and which worked better. He loved the hues, the colors of the paint, and he would talk about those. Just everything about the art world, the canvas. And he was unique in that, like a doctor, he would wear this white coat. Thinking about it now, I didn't really think about it at the time, but now thinking about him, he had just this professional aura that he would, he would wear suits and he would also wear this white coat and paint in it. And if you Google him, you can see him in his studio. A very classy gentleman. He had so many stories because of all of these fabulous people he would be hanging out with painting. But one thing Kinstler loved to do before he painted his subject was get to know his subject, even if it was a quick meeting before they started. He would just start having them casually talk to him. He didn't want someone to just pose in a frozen way. And if you are an artist who paints portraiture, this is another one I painted. This is a live model that, as opposed from a photo of a Picasso, this was a woman who posed for me years ago, and this was done in oil. There's something about someone holding a pose and you not wanting them to move and capturing them. And this woman, it was, she was posing for a group of us. So she was holding a pose, not moving. Capturing that versus capturing someone who is talking to you. And of course, as I'm talking to you and being animated, someone who starts talking to you in an animated way gives off lots of different looks and lots of different movements. Kinstler loved that. He loved someone engaging with him. He would talk to them as he was doing his work, and they would talk back to him. And in this, he would say, hold this, he wanted someone in a certain position, but he also wanted to get the feel of them, who they were, who their spirit was. Because again, if you just sit there, you're in a costume. Just like Andy Warhol did those wonderful portraits where people would just come to his studio and they would pose without saying anything, without moving, just staring into the camera. You were getting something from that in the stillness. But then if they start talking, as actors do, many of those people Andy Warhol was portraying were actors. Then you see this animation, and that animation comes from the spirit that's inside of us that is igniting this whole costume. If you are an artist and you haven't tried this, you should. Kinstler made something extremely difficult look very easy. Most artists want the model to stay perfectly still. And they aren't necessarily communicating with the model either. You might have a friend or a family member that poses for you, so you know them. But if you're hiring someone and you're engaging with them, totally different experience. And that's what Kinstler would do. He would get to know these people on the spot quickly as he was rendering their portraits. And I think that's what gave his portraits life, a spirit. He really tapped into the soul. So cheers again to Everett Raymond Kinstler. He is missed. He will be missed. But thank God I had the opportunity to study with him, to communicate with him. And recently, a few years back, I was in Washington, D.C. at the portrait conference and had an opportunity to see him again. And it just was like we melted together as artists, friends, a mentor, student relationship, and it was such a joy to see him, and that memory will be held forever fondly in my heart. He gave of his time, he gave of his words, he gave of his art, his energy. He was just a dynamic person. Now behind me, I love Picasso. He and I share the same birth date, but this man, I separate his art from his manness because he was a very terrible man to women. Things he was said and did to women, not good at all. But he was an amazing artist. That's the reason why I painted him with bull horns, because not only would he run around his studio with a bull mask, he identified with the bull, he also was a bull with the women. And here behind me, the woman here, I drew her with the shadow of a man's head because there's a lot of symbolism and meaning to that, how women are in the shadow of men often. Have a beautiful day.